In the summer of 1940, Europe looked up and saw a new kind of terror, formations of German aircraft moving with confidence, precision, and the arrogance of a force that believed it had already won the future. The Luftwaffe had helped shatter Poland, the Low Countries, and France with speed that seemed almost unreal, and inside the Third Reich, one man stood at the centre of that legend like a jewelled crown. Hermann Göring, Hitler's most decorated loyalist, the self-styled master of the air, the man who loved applause as much as victory. But air power is a brutal instrument. It demands truth, logistics, humility before physics, and leaders who can absorb bad news without punishing the messenger. Göring was the opposite of that discipline. He built an image of control, and then began to govern the Luftwaffe as if image mattered more than reality. This story is not simply about aircraft and battles. It is about how ego becomes strategy, how vanity becomes doctrine, and how the fear of admitting limits can quietly rot an entire institution from the top down. The question is simple, and it cuts like a knife. When Germany's air power died, was it because the Allies were stronger, or because Göring could not tolerate the truth long enough to fight the war that actually existed? To understand the downfall, we have to meet the man behind the medals. Hermann Göring did not rise as a quiet administrator or a careful strategist. He rose as a symbol, and he knew it. A celebrated fighter ace from the First World War, an early Nazi loyalist, and one of the few men who could speak to Hitler with the familiarity of an old comrade, Göring built his power on spectacle, prestige, and proximity to the Führer. And when the Luftwaffe became a weapon of the new Germany, he treated it not only as a military instrument, but as a stage where he could perform greatness. Titles gathered around him like trophies: Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall, overseer of vast economic empires, and the man who promised Hitler what Hitler wanted most: certainty. In dictatorships, the currency of survival is confidence, not accuracy, and Göring learned to trade in bold claims with a salesman's smile. He surrounded himself with flattery, rewarded loyalty over competence, and grew addicted to the feeling that he was indispensable. Because to Göring, the Luftwaffe was not merely an air force, it was proof that he belonged at the centre of history. That need to be seen as the genius behind German air power became a trap. It pushed him toward decisions that looked brilliant in speeches but collapsed under calculation, and it trained the institution beneath him to protect the leader's pride rather than protect the nation's capability. The seeds of destruction were planted early, inside the very way Göring wanted to be loved. At first it looked like genius, until success became a mirror. The early war years made Göring's ego feel like destiny. In Poland and then in the campaigns of 1940, the Luftwaffe struck with speed and coordination that seemed to prove every boast: bombers and dive bombers hammering communications, fighters sweeping the skies, ground forces advancing under an umbrella of fear. But this success carried a poison. It taught Göring that intimidation could replace endurance, and that dramatic results in short campaigns could be treated as a permanent law of war. Instead of building an air force designed for long-range attrition, deep strategic bombing, and sustained pilot training, the Luftwaffe remained shaped by the kind of warfare that made Göring look brilliant quickly: rapid operations, short distances, and victories that could be announced like trophies. It also fed a dangerous habit at the top: the belief that confidence itself was a weapon. When problems appeared, maintenance strain, pilot fatigue, production limits, the growing gap between promises and reality, they were treated as irritations, not alarms. Göring did not want a culture that told him what he did not want to hear. He wanted a culture that kept the legend intact. So the Luftwaffe entered its greatest test, not as a machine prepared for a long, grinding war, but as a force intoxicated by applause, where the leader's pride began to weigh as heavily as fuel, ammunition, and aircraft. Then came the test Britain wouldn't fail, and Göring couldn't admit. In 1940, the Luftwaffe met a kind of enemy it could not simply frighten into collapse. An island with radar, hardened command and control, and a fighter force that didn't need to conquer Europe, only to survive. Göring walked into the Battle of Britain convinced that the same formula that had helped break France would break the Royal Air Force too: smash airfields, grind down fighters, and open the way for invasion. But here, ego became strategy. He wanted a dramatic, fast victory he could present as inevitable, and that hunger distorted judgment at the exact moment precision mattered most. The Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighters couldn't match the best British single-seat fighters. The Bf 109, excellent in combat, was shackled by range when operating over southern England, forcing escort decisions that were never truly solved. Even worse, Göring's headquarters repeatedly clung to optimistic assessments that the RAF was nearly finished, that one more push would snap it, because in Göring's world, admitting the enemy was holding was the same as admitting he was wrong. The turning point came when target priorities lurched. Pressure on fighter command's infrastructure eased as the Luftwaffe shifted toward bombing London and other cities, a move that looked powerful to the public, but gave Britain's air defence system breathing room at the critical hour. The Luftwaffe could burn neighbourhoods, but it could not burn away the RAF's ability to fight, and the longer it went on, the more aircraft and experienced crews Germany lost in a battle that rewarded patience, not theatrics. When Britain did not break, the legend cracked, and Göring's need to look unstoppable pushed him further from the truth that could have saved his air power. From that point on, the Luftwaffe stopped telling the truth. After Britain, the most dangerous damage was not only in lost aircraft, it was in the habits that formed at the top. Göring had promised victory, and when victory didn't arrive, the system around him learned a lesson. Reality was optional, but optimism was mandatory. In an air war, accurate reporting is life itself. Loss rates, serviceability, pilot exhaustion, spare parts, fuel, training hours. These are the bones beneath the skin of any confident speech. Yet Göring's court rewarded the kind of numbers that sounded good, not the kind that were useful. Overclaiming became routine, bad news became career poison, and commanders understood that survival depended on feeding Göring what he wanted: reassurance, certainty, the comforting story that success was always one decision away. This is how ego turns into institutional blindness. Instead of confronting the strategic consequences of a long war, especially against enemies with enormous industrial depth, Göring leaned harder into performance. He quarrelled, postured, and protected his status, while the Luftwaffe's structural weaknesses deepened. Pilot training pipelines could not keep pace with losses. Aircraft production struggled to meet the demands of multiple fronts, and the doctrine remained trapped between supporting the army and fighting for air superiority without fully mastering either on a sustained scale. The Luftwaffe became a force that could still strike, but it was losing the ability to regenerate. And once an air force loses the ability to replace experienced men faster than it loses them, defeat is no longer a single event. It becomes a slow mechanical certainty. The tragedy is that the warning signs were visible, yet in Göring's world truth was treated as disloyalty. And then he made the promise that sounded heroic and became a death sentence. The clearest moment where Göring's ego collided with the laws of air power came at Stalingrad, and it unfolded like a courtroom exhibit for everything that had gone wrong. In the winter of 1942–43, the German Sixth Army was encircled, cut off, freezing and starving. The only way to keep it alive was to deliver massive quantities of supplies every day through the air, an operation that demanded aircraft, airfields, weather windows, fuel, crews, navigation, and a brutal honesty about capacity. Göring, facing Hitler's fury and desperate for a solution that kept both the army and his own prestige intact, promised what could not be reliably done, that the Luftwaffe would supply the pocket from the sky. It was the kind of pledge that made him sound powerful in the Führer's ear. It was also, in practice, a machine designed to eat aircraft and pilots. Winter weather, Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and the sheer distances involved turned the air bridge into a slaughter. Transport planes that Germany could not easily replace were lost, veteran crews were burned away, and the Luftwaffe's already strained transport arm was crippled at exactly the moment the broader war demanded flexibility. Stalingrad did not just destroy an army. It destroyed a reserve of aviation experience and equipment that Germany could not afford to lose. And the psychological consequence was just as fatal. Once Göring had made a promise to please Hitler rather than to match reality, it trained the highest leadership to believe that air power was magic, something you could summon with confidence, regardless of physics and arithmetic. That is why Stalingrad stands as the climax of this story. It is the point where Göring's ego didn't merely mislead strategy. It consumed the Luftwaffe's future in exchange for a few weeks of illusion. While pilots bled, the leadership performed. By the time the war turned against Germany, the Luftwaffe was fighting two battles at once, one in the sky and another against the decay spreading through its own leadership culture. Göring's world became increasingly insulated, comfort, luxury and politics at the top, while squadrons at the front dealt with shortages, fatigue and the grinding mathematics of a losing air war. The distance between appearance and reality widened into something almost obscene. An effective air force in crisis demands ruthless prioritization, training, maintenance, replacement pilots, aircraft availability, and clear command responsibility. But Göring's leadership was not built for disciplined reform. It was built for loyalty, showmanship, and personal empire. Corruption and favor trading distorted decisions, and the Luftwaffe's strategic focus fractured across competing demands, personalities, and promises that could not all be fulfilled at once. The result was not just material weakness, but moral exhaustion. Frontline personnel could feel that the institution above them was lying, and that the price of those lies was being paid in burning engines and empty cockpits. In that environment, even brilliant pilots and capable commanders were forced to fight inside a system that could not tell the truth about its own condition. This is how ego kills capability. Not in one dramatic moment, but through a slow poisoning of priorities until the Air Force becomes a stage, while the enemy builds a machine. Even Germany's last technological miracle couldn't survive ego politics. By 1943 and 1944, the air war had changed into something the early Luftwaffe was never built to endure. A sustained industrial duel over Germany itself, day after day, as Allied bombers returned in heavier waves, now guarded by long-range escorts that could follow them deep into the Reich and hunt German fighters on the way up, on the way down, and sometimes even over their own airfields. This was the moment when Germany needed cold, unromantic decisions, fuel prioritized for training, aircraft designs chosen for what could be produced and maintained at scale, pilots protected long enough to become veterans, and leadership willing to admit that air defense was now a national emergency. Instead, Göring's command culture, prestige first, truth second, turned crisis into chaos. Fighter leaders who demanded realism and reform were increasingly treated as irritants, while Göring demanded results that sounded heroic: destroy the bomber streams, restore the legend, make the numbers look better. And when Germany finally held a potential game-changer in its hands, the jet fighter, the Me-262, politics and image fought over it like vultures. The jet became a symbol to be claimed, not simply a tool to be deployed rationally, and precious time and effort were tangled in arguments about roles, priorities, and promises made to impress Hitler rather than to meet the enemy's reality. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's real lifeblood, trained pilots and fuel, was drying up, so even modern aircraft arrived into squadrons that could not fully exploit them. In the end, the Reich did not lose the air war because it lacked brilliant machines. It lost because leadership vanity kept treating war like theatre long after the enemy had turned it into mathematics. By the time the truth arrived, it arrived as fire. When Allied air superiority fully matured, it did not announce itself with a single battle. It arrived as a constant presence, a daily pressure that turned German cities into targets, rail lines into wreckage, fuel into scarcity, and the very act of moving an army into a gamble. Bombing campaigns did more than destroy buildings. They strangled the systems a modern air force needs to survive. Refineries, transport, manufacturing flow, repair capacity, and pilot training schedules. As losses mounted and the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the sky weakened, Göring's response followed the pattern that had ruined him: deflection, promises, and scapegoating. Instead of a clear admission of strategic failure and a coherent reform program early enough to matter, the leadership drifted between denial and panic. Commanders were blamed, rivalries intensified, and political survival became entangled with operational decisions. Göring's authority, once wrapped in medals and ceremony, began to rot in plain sight. Hitler's confidence cracked, and with it, Göring's ability to protect his position by simply projecting certainty. But by this stage, even removing the man could not restore what had been lost. The Luftwaffe had been drained of its trained corps. Aircraft were increasingly flown by men with fewer hours, less experience, and less time to learn before facing opponents who were growing more practiced and better supported every month. That is the cruel reality of air power. Once you lose the ability to generate skill faster than you lose it, defeat becomes inevitable. And by 1944 into 1945, the truth was no longer something Göring could suppress. It was visible in the daylight over Germany, in contrails and explosions, in the sound of engines that belonged to someone else. So, when did Germany lose the air war, really? If you ask when Germany's air power died, many people point to the end: the ruined cities, the grounded aircraft, the jets that arrived too late, the bombers overhead like an unbreakable sentence. But the deeper verdict is harsher. Germany began losing the air war the moment its top air leader made ego more important than truth. Investigators of failure, military historians, post-war interrogations, the records of production, losses and training, keep circling the same pattern. Göring's need to appear decisive encouraged promises that could not be kept, punished realism, and cultivated a command climate where flattering numbers replaced accurate ones. The Battle of Britain exposed the first major crack, a strategic test that demanded humility and adaptation, not performance. Stalingrad then turned that crack into a break, a vow made for prestige that burned irreplaceable aircraft and crews for an illusion of control. And when the great industrial air war arrived over Germany, the Luftwaffe faced it without enough trained pilots, without enough fuel, and without a leadership culture capable of admitting limits soon enough to rebuild. The final lesson is not only about Göring, it's about power itself. Any system that makes truth dangerous becomes blind, and blindness in modern war is fatal. So remember the opening image, the sky that seemed to surrender. It never surrendered to Germany. It was only borrowed for a moment, and Göring's ego spent it like it would last forever, until the sky came back, and Germany could no longer afford the price of its own illusion.